Hey everybody, welcome back. We're going to be going over some Lightroom basic techniques, tips, tricks, everything that I've learned over the last couple years of using Lightroom. It'll be especially helpful for those of you who haven't really dealt with Lightroom. You just want all the attention, don't you? Let's hop right into Lightroom and I'll show you how to import files to start. So when you open Lightroom, this is the first page you're probably going to see. If you look down here on your left, if you haven't already seen the import dialog show up, we'll go ahead and select import. Now here you're going to go through all of your files to figure out what photos that you want to import. I've already imported this photo right here, but just for reference, let's go ahead and let's import this photo as well. So you'll unselect all the other photos that you don't need, select the photos that you want, press import, and then you'll see here previous import however many photos that you've just imported. For this sample, I've already added to my quick collection the 3 photos we're going to go over. It's a wedding from last summer, it's nature scene that I took from last fall, and then a senior from this last spring. So let's go ahead and start with the wedding photo. I'm going to start with the overall exposure, maybe adding a little bit of contrast. I try not to take it more than 10 to 15. So I'm going to start off by taking the highlights down, maybe around 35. And shadows, you can pull back the detail from the shadows or you can drop it down to give you more of that contrasted look. For this specific one, there's not a lot of detail in the shadows that I need. So I'm going to go ahead and drop down to 40. You can see as I move the whites, you get more of that glow versus the dull effect. And for me personally, I like having whites up a little bit just to give it that white glow. I like moving my blacks down a little bit just to deepen those blacks, to deepen those shadows. It gives you a little bit more of a pop in your photo. So here we'll move in, this is a 1-to-1 ratio. You can move in 2-to-1, get really in on those details. Back over on the texture slider, pulling that texture down really smooths everything out, which can give a nice glowing soft light effect, but I would never take it down more than 30 at most. I'm typically around 15 just to get smooth details. Clarity, if we pull that clarity up, you can see as more of the detail is defined. But with people, I tend to drop my clarity down, my texture down, just because you don't need the detail in the skin. It looks much better to have a smooth, without looking unrealistic effect. So we'll back out. Dehaze will not only deepen your blacks and bring forward your highlights, it's going to saturate your image as well. If we go reverse, you can see it brings the haze from those sun rays back. Dehaze is a tool I enjoy using quite often, but rarely will I even take it above plus 15. For this image, plus 5 looks about good. Saturation, vibrance, these sliders are really helpful for your final tweak in the edit. But to start off, let's just go ahead. I like having my saturation around -10 because it kind of just dulls all of the colors out slightly. And then vibrance, we can bring some of the vibrance of the color back. I'm going to add 3 points to the tone curve. And so giving this S curve adds a nice contrast to the overall image. And as you'll see here, if you grab the very end of the blacks and you start to pull up on the side, gives you that crushed, faded black look that a lot of people go for. I typically keep my blacks at most 5.5%. All right, here we have our HSL sliders. So we have hue, saturation, luminance. I have it selected to all just because it's easier to manipulate everything you need all on that one page to see what you've done. If you've started off here with color, if this is what your screen looks like, I suggest moving over to HSL, selecting all. So before we get started here, let's go ahead and scroll all the way down to the bottom of our toolbar. In the calibration tab, and you can see here the slight change in the color of the grass, giving it more of a golden look. instead of the yellow, the greenish yellow look. We'll leave it there at -15. Now we can pull down the saturation of the image. We'll say around 45 looks good. Now my greens. You can see here how it almost pulls out all of the yellow color, and we're just left with a nice orange. And then we'll go ahead, we can move down the overall saturation of my greens. And now with the red primary, I like moving my sliders to see what look I'm going for, what I like. I develop my photos as I edit. I have an idea of what I want them to look like, but it's always a safe bet just to play around and feel out the photo. I'm thinking we pull those reds a little more to the orange side to keep our skin tones looking a little more natural. So from all the adjustments we've made so far, I'm going to show you guys a hotkey. It's the backslash on your keyboard. You'll see up here, this is the before, this is the image that we started with, and this is after. This is what we've done so far. I'm always turning on before and after. So let's go back up to the HSL sliders, and we're going to work our way down. So starting off, these are all of the hues. You can manipulate each specific color within the photo. Orange, we can slide a little bit both ways, and you'll see as the skin tones are manipulated. And I think I'm just going to move my skin tones a little more toward the orange yellow side so they're not too saturated with a red tone. Now the yellows, I like having more of a golden look in the field, so we're going to drop that down to about 30. Saturation, we'll leave reds alone. Orange, because that's going to match our skin, I'm going to pull my orange down just a little bit. I don't need as much saturation in my orange right now. Yellow, we can go ahead and look at. It gets rid of all of the color in the field, but I think we want to keep that golden glow in the field. So let's go ahead and boost that. Greens we're going to leave alone. The rest of these we're going to leave alone. And now the luminance, I'm going to leave reds alone. Orange is really manipulating the field and the skin tones. We're going to bring some luminance into our orange. And we're going to pull down a little bit in the yellow. We're going to leave the rest of these alone. Before, after. Split toning is a fun tool to use. It manipulates the highlights and the shadows. And as you'll see, saturation, we'll move our saturation and the highlights from whatever hue this is on, and it gives your photo a real distinct look depending on what style you are going after. Right around there looks good. And drop that saturation back down. So here's with nothing. So maybe we'll leave it there. And then in the shadows, a good opposite of our orange highlights is a nice blue shadow. So we can pull that down. You'll see the shadows begin to have a little bit of color. So we'll leave that about there. And then the balance, if you pull it toward the right, you'll get more of your highlights. And you pull it toward the left, you'll get more of your shadows in those colors that we've now adjusted. So we'll go ahead and leave that there. And now these little tabs within each section are on and off for that effect only. So here is without split toning, and here is with split toning. And you'll see just the slight difference in our highlights. So now detail, for a photo like this, it's really well exposed and there's a lot of detail. It's a low ISO, so we're not having to deal with much noise. But I'll run my noise reduction luminance slider to 10 just to smooth it over. Here's before, here's after. So here we are. Before, after. I like to adjust all of my color settings and then go back and look at all of my exposure settings. I can see I want my highlights a little lighter and the shadow detail. Let's go ahead and pull some of it back just because that also lightens up our subjects right here. And we're going to add a radial filter. So click, hold, and drag. And we're going to make it a decent size, so there's just a little bit of these corners that are on the outside of our circle. If you hold your cursor over the center, it's going to show you in red what is affected by this radial filter. Another good trick, if you press O on your keyboard, it'll do the same thing, but you can now move your mouse around. We'll put it about here. We'll adjust the feathering as well. And now I'm going to pull down my exposure by about -0.3. I'm going to pull down the highlights. Pull down my shadows, maybe a little bit of the blacks, but I'm going to leave a tiny bit of the whites up. We'll select the tab before our radial filter, after our radial filter. And it just brings a little bit more of the viewer's attention into the subject without really knowing. Press Y to see a side-by-side before and after. And now you can really see the difference. This yellow green haze on the skin, it's something that you don't fully notice before you've edited your photo. It looks great coming out of camera, but by editing your photos, you can manipulate them into exactly what you want. All right, moving on to the next photo. So here's a shot that I would use on my personal Instagram. So the first thing I do when I get images, unless I want to showcase the entire image, the 2:3 crop size, which this is, we're going to crop to 4:5, which is Instagram. So I'm going to go through this image really quick and show you my final result using the same techniques that I just showed you. We are going to use a brush filter. I'm going to click and hold down on my mouse and page over the area. If you hold your cursor on it, you'll see the selected area, or by pressing O, it'll continue to show the selected area. With this brush tool, we can select just the highlights in just this section, and we can bring them up, we can bring them down. We can manipulate any one of these sliders, and it will only affect what's in this highlighted area. And this is also where you can introduce some haze into your image by pulling the dehaze slider to the left. We can smoothen out the detail to give it more of a foggy look. And from here, with temp over white balance of just the selected area, we're going to fake a little bit of sunlight through our fog. So here's before, here's after our edit. All right, moving on to the last image, a senior photo. We're going to move down to the calibration tab to start. And I want to give this image a little bit more orange versus teal. So we're going to pull the saturation down a little bit, pull the hue down a little bit, maybe even raise up our hue on the green, add a little bit of that color back. We're going to move our red hue up a little bit just to kind of match our skin tones a little more to the image, and pull down the overall saturation. So we're just going to select this tab of a red hue in the brick wall behind, which I like, instead of this kind of green and orange look. We can even warm this image up a little bit, introduce a little bit more orange, especially into our skin. So here's before, here's after, moving in a good direction. I'm going to pull the exposure down. I'm going to add a little bit of contrast. You can see already that pops. It looks a little bit more defined. Our highlights can come down so our face isn't too shiny. There's not a lot of detail in our shadows that we need to see, so I'm going to go ahead and pull those down. I'm going to pull the whites down a little bit too, a little bit down on the blacks. Again, we're going to pull texture and clarity down just to smoothen out the skin. And to give it a more defined look, we're going to pull up dehaze and bring back some of that color that we've lost. Pull down the overall saturation, increase the vibrance. We'll add a slight contrast curve. I'm going to pull the yellow hues more toward the orange. Let's go ahead and add our blues a little bit to the purple side to bring some of that color back that we originally edited out with our calibration. I'm going to leave all the other hues alone. Now we'll move on to the saturation. The orange saturation, I think we'll pull down just a tiny bit so we're not getting too much orange. Now the yellow saturation I'll pull down quite a bit just because I don't need that color. Blue will bring up a little bit of saturation to bring it back, leave everything else alone. Now the luminance, we're going to pull down on the blue, which just gives it that same hue but a darker shade of it. We're going to pull down on the yellow, and we're going to add just a tiny bit of luminance to our orange, to our skin tones, to give more pop to our subject. We're going to leave everything else alone. Let's slide back to the top. Let's pull back a little bit on our overall temp. We're going to leave split toning alone. Let's go ahead and add some noise reduction, and that looks good. Let's add a radial filter. We're going to go ahead and pull down a little bit on our overall exposure, pull those shadows down, highlights, whites, blacks. And that gives us that much more focus on our subject. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and show you how to export all of these photos, and we'll go over the settings used for client purposes or online purposes, especially with your images that are just going to go straight to Instagram. So let's export this first photo. I'm going to press Command-Shift-E on my Mac. We're going to export to hard drive, and I like having it set up to where I can choose what specific folder I want my images to be exported to. Choose specific folder, and now we can choose what folder we want. It's going to be left on the last folder that you had selected. So I'm going to choose my hard drive. I'm going to choose into my clients, Alex Senior Photos. I make a folder for my best images before editing and then the images after they're edited. So let's choose edits. And we'll leave all this alone. So now file naming. I do custom name with sequence because I like to batch export my photos when I'm working for clients. Type in Alex-Senior Photos. We can add the date of the session if we want, anything that makes it more specific. As you'll see here as an example, the -1 start number. We're going to get that on the end of our photo, so we don't need to add that ourselves. We're going to scroll down to our file settings. I always export with JPEG. It condenses the file down to a much more manageable size. Quality, leave at 100. Leave everything else alone. And now here for our resolution, if I was going to send this to my clients, I would leave the resolution at 300 pixels per inch. That's going to give you much more detail in the overall image. But if this was something I wanted to share to Instagram, I would put it at 72, which is the universal for all online images. So let's leave this at 300 for now. And now watermarking is a nice option if you want to watermark your images, but I don't watermark anything that I send to my clients for their personal use. I want them to have the just edited file with no markings on it. But if this is something that I wanted to put onto my Instagram or my Facebook, I will watermark my images just to keep credit. I made my own watermark with Adobe InDesign. I've made all sorts of different watermarks, different logos for my business. Here you can upload your JPEG or PNG. Make sure it has a clear background so that there's nothing distracting. It's just the text. You can leave all these options alone. Opacity, I keep around 75. I like to keep my watermarks pretty small and out of the way. You can choose where you want your watermark to go, and from there make adjustments as needed. I like keeping my watermark down toward the bottom of my image, and it sits just above where any cutoff for Instagram or Facebook is. I already have the watermark I need, so I'm going to cancel out of this. But now my watermark is selected, so it will export that watermark on this image. If you're working on a white background and you want to have a black background, select into your preferences. We'll choose interface. Now you have your main window. I like black. Secondary window, which are these side panels. We'll choose darker gray. Okay, well, that's it. That's all I have for today. I hope this video was really helpful for you guys that are just starting with photography and Lightroom. I highly recommend editing your photos just because it will distinguish your personal style. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. Maybe subscribe to my channel too. I'm going to start making more tutorials and just overall vlogs. Yeah. All right, see you in the next one. No. No, don't. Go. Come on. Off you go. Off you go.